Psychic Politics, an Aspect Psychology book by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Continuation Part 3, Chapter 23. The Natural Contours of the Psyche. No one has really tried to map the natural contours of the psyche. Few even wonder if it can be done. You can't do it by considering the psyche a more or less local and confined phenomenon, as Freud did, waiting just off the shore of our usually focused awareness. Freud rummaged about in an area between the psyche, shore, and ocean, examining the eddies, seeing the mud, all the while staying where he was, never going further to ride the great tidal waves of the psyche that came thundering majestically in. He examined only the natural debris that washed out from the shores of mind, but he never glimpsed the inrush of power and energy that constantly refreshes and revitalizes ordinary consciousness. For our consciousness itself rushes in and out, encounters physical reality, forms its three-dimensional spirals, sand castles and rocks, and withdraws back into the depths of itself once again in gigantic and minute patterns that are etched in the very convolutions and ridges of our brains. Day, and the tide of our consciousness splashes against the objective earth, the pattern of its motion scattering the stones and pebbles of events outward, impinging in the world of time, making scrawls in historic sands, and night, when we withdraw into the depths from which the shores emerge, and from which our waking consciousness surely springs. Carl Jung at least knew that there was such an ocean. He felt the undertow, dreamed of the distant breakers, and sensed the towering shapes that rose and fell, forming all the smaller ones. But how far can our normal consciousness go out into that figurative ocean? It is part of that ocean all the time, of course, composed of the same ingredients, participating in its motion. But when we travel bravely out of our usual depths and bring back souvenirs, but however strange they appear there, when we get them back to shore, they're somehow the same old thing. They seem to go through a metamorphosis. Intuitions and revelations that seem so sparkling and original at the time of discovery often turn seedy. It's as if we've captured a fine mysterious creature out of the depths of the ocean, a creature that seems to belong to a species we've never seen before. Triumphant, filled with hope and surprise, we bring our prize in, whatever way we can. But when we get back, before we can even shout, quote, "Hey, look what I've found," end quote, we see that the creature is, after all, of a well-known species, somewhat exotic, perhaps, because not too many people go out far enough to find its habitat. Yet we could have sworn, out there where we saw it, that we've discovered something of invaluable merit or original design. So our mystical visions escape us. When we're caught up in the tidal wave of the psyche's sudden acceleration, riding it with the heady, fresh spray of insights breaking all around us, we can hardly believe the originality of our perceptions or the significance of our new knowledge. When we ride the breakers back to shore, though, grasping our new catch in the net of our thoughts, we find on examination that we have another floppy Christ fish, a seaweedy Buddha that someone else has thrown away, or another crumbled virgin doll. Debris, we think, nothing new, but the old standard versions after all. Disappointed, we remember the high feeling of certainty and inspiration we felt riding that breaker, and we wonder, was it all a lie? For something happens when we try to translate inner intuitive data into ordinary terms. It works, at a certain level, as instances of telepathy and clairvoyance imply. But beyond that, gross dissertations seem to occur. I've read that there are some strange sea creatures in the depths of the ocean, precisely attuned to their environment. But try to bring them up and you have corpses, they change from alive to dead on the way. To see them, you have to go there, to their territory. So maybe original visions change in the same way, adapting to our environment on the journey back, just in order to stay alive at all. They may adapt themselves to some degree to the atmosphere of ordinary consciousness. But how much are we responsible for this unfortunate transformation? William Blake, the 18th century mystic and painter, saw visions all the time. Once he painted the spirit of a flea as it appeared to him early one evening. He saw it three-dimensionally, and whatever it was a personal sense experience which he then used to create a work of art. And what a remarkable and weird work of art it was. Here was no light, airy vision, no fairy creature with gossamer wings. Blake drew a husky, horrible, man-animal demon, dripping blood, bloated and hairy. As far as I'm concerned, this is perfectly legitimate as the basis for a work of art. You paint it as you see it. But why did Blake see it that way? Question. He viewed his own visions through his religion-soaked beliefs, so that his spirit of a flea had little to do with a flea or its spirit, but with his ideas about the grotesqueness of evil. Blake was a great mystic and artist despite all this. Yet I'm bound to wonder what he would have produced if he allowed his magnificent vision its own sight. I came across his drawing of the flea's spirit as I was working on this chapter, and I thought that it was an excellent example of the transformations that can happen to visions or revelations. Someone else might have seen a nicer flea, or turned it into a romanticized fairy creature, but Blake's genius could turn even a distorted vision into art. If we could perceive the spirit of a flea, most likely we couldn't capture it anyhow. It would be an aura or atmosphere or invisible incline of being, a living knot of moving space, to be felt, perhaps, but never captured. Only we feel that we do have to capture our visions and cast them in physical terms. Doing so might be the one definite way of losing whatever it was we thought we had found. I wrote this poem about Blake and his visions after I saw the drawing of the flea, and as I was musing further about how our beliefs might program the content of our visions and insights. Poem. Come into my parlor. William Blake broke the sky apart with his visions. Stars and planets tipped sideways, fell into his head in stringing fragments, till bits of gods exploded. Hells and heavens streamed out of his beaded eyes, spreading saints and demons out onto his cottage floor. Avenging angels, swords drawn, advanced upon his garden lawn at twilight, slaying gargoyles, and when he opened his back door, he never knew who might be standing there, ghost or demon, black eyes swirling in volcanic sockets, sprouting smoke, flaming skin hotter than his kitchen stove. He didn't care if they'd sit for a portrait. He'd let them in and invite them to stay their peace, while his hell-heaven scorched fingers sketched, or he'd turn them into poems with a sudden flick of his magic mind, imprisoning them in verse, laughing when they shouted to be let out, caught between the shining bars of his magnetic vowels, tricked. All the heavenly and hellish hordes found his humble house, drawn down the burning chimney of his soul, as if it were a hole in the sky, and they fell through, till finally the heavens emptied, and the last seraphim, devil, saint, and every last image of God was captured, held beyond escape, in a miniature firmament, infinite within its frame, but confined to paintings hung upon a wall. End of poem. Or maybe I'm being too hard on Blake and all of us. The psyche or non-physical world might not exist apart from our projections, that is, it may be so plastic, creative, and psychically rubber that it automatically translates itself into what we think it is. In other words, its responsiveness to our feelings might be so acute and accurate that it takes on the shape expected of it. If so, then we would always see what we believed we would see, and our visions of gods and their routines would more or less agree through the centuries, providing their own separate, quote, evidential data, end quote, just as our accepted physical world does. We're beginning to understand that physical reality exists differently than our sense experience with it. Our general agreement in the nature of objects betrays us to that degree, because objects just don't exist the way we think they do. On the other hand, as I write, I put my coffee cup on the table and grin, thinking that we must be pretty much all right somehow. To put solid cups that really don't exist on solid tables that aren't real either, using hands that are made up of swiftly moving molecules, with space more than anything else holding them together. A triple trick of some merit, done without the slightest strain at all. It follows, of course, that we aren't really solid either, though we certainly seem to be. But the gods, demons, and other conventionalized versions of mystic experience might be psychic stereotypes presenting their own kind of evidential material at another level of reality, no more or less valid than our solidity of cups and people, but just as handy. But if atoms and molecules are behind our physical reality, what is behind the psychological reality of these other agreed-upon entities? In our alterations of consciousness, our inner searchings, we are looking for a basic reality or the stuff out of which realities are made. For this, it's necessary to break through known patterns. If atoms and molecules are the inner components of cups and people, then what is the equivalent makeup of gods, demons, and their ensemble on another level? We see physical reality because of neurological training and triggering. If our sense perceptions are off just a bit, we perceive a slightly different picture of a mass-accepted world. I have little depth perception, for example. In some strange manner, do I really see a truer version of space, an unofficial one, because my vision is not tuned into the recognized pattern as clearly as usual? Question. Is it possible that where sense patterns are eccentric, we might have a clearer point through which to view whatever it is reality is, apart from our normal perception? In the same way, the visions that don't agree with the various religious and mystic dogmas that aren't couched in terms of Christ, Jehovah, or Buddha might present holes in the official picture through which a glimmer of inner reality seeps. The vision that makes us uncomfortable, that doesn't fit, the one that we can't so easily explain, may give us hints and further directions in which to probe. Such visions make us uncomfortable, precisely because they are unfamiliar, and this instinctively frightens us. It's bad enough to disagree with our fellows over different elements in a mass-shared reality, but unorthodox visions make us fear madness. At least the religious myths provide a framework of a kind in which reincarnated St. Paul's, the disciples, Christ, and known saints can find a fit, however uneasily. But true vision wouldn't provide that kind of conflict with the accepted facts of our world, because the inner reality would be seen as the source from which exterior events spring. I'm not knocking the physical senses here, or saying that other dimensions are a priori better than ours. Only that we must not automatically dress other reality perceptions in the terms of conventional stereotypes to make them fit. As I was working on this chapter, I received a phone call that illustrates what I mean. Lonnie, I'll call her, was a secretary in a large city on the West Coast. She'd phoned me once or twice in the past. This time her voice was excited, filled with a funny kind of wonder, with only undertones expressing a persistent, sardonic questioning. Quote, "I've just been to a psychic palmist," she said. Then with a touch of skepticism, "Well, you know, that's what she's supposed to be. She reads the lines in your hand, but she really uses her psychic abilities too. I mean, she doesn't just rely on the lines," end quote. Her voice ended in a question. "Go on," I said. Quote, "Well, she read me. I mean, she really read me. She knew what I was like inside. She told me that I didn't feel as if I belonged, and that I was uneasy in my environment, that I felt like an outcast. And you know, that's true." End quote. "Okay," I said. Quote, "Well, I was impressed by that. She'd never seen me before." Lonnie paused. She gave an embarrassed laugh that hid a hope and went on quickly. "Then the woman said to me, quote, 'Of course you don't feel as if you belong, because you don't.'" End quote. Another pause. In my mind's eye I saw Lonnie sitting there, modishly thin, rather elegantly boned, chick, looking what? Modern, sophisticated, something like that. Lonnie repeated the woman's words again with a long, drawn-out, mystified sigh. Quote, "You don't belong." That's exactly what she told me. Then she said that I really belonged to the fairies. Did you ever hear anything like that? Question. She said that they were, well, like another species, and that I belonged to them more than anything else. That's why I've always felt as if I didn't belong. End quote. I couldn't say anything for a minute. Quote, "I know it sounds batty," Lonnie said, "but what do you think? Isn't it wonderful?" End quote. The wonder had broken through her voice. Santa Claus lived all over again. And she was like a kid at Christmas, given a gift too good to be true. And I was obviously the one she'd chosen to take the tinsel off the package, or she wouldn't have called. She knew me at least well enough to suspect what my attitude would be. Yet I hated to dabble with that wonder, that baby hope. If she wanted to believe that she was part of a fairy generation, that was her business. There are worse beliefs. Except that she'd asked me what I thought. Quote, "Well," she said impatiently, "nutty as it sounds, I think it's true. Anything is possible." End quote. Quote, "I think it's a psychological con," I said gently. "This is what I think." End quote. And I started in. Symbolically, the statement may have accurately described the way Lonnie felt, and given her a fantasy to explain her sense of alienation, a child's dream, beautiful at age 3 or 7, Peter Pan, who never grows old, poetic statements of inner truths, but not to be taken literally, as any child knows. Lonnie was having real problems in the workaday world, in a way, she was wandering in a fairyland, but she needed to get her footing here. She didn't need an excuse for not relating to the world. An imprisoned fairy who can't live in this world is a different thing than a free-flying one, comfortable in both realms, which is beside the point. I'm not saying that the psychic was a fraud either. She may have picked up impressions about Lonnie quite besides any clues she received from Lonnie's manner, and I'd accept her statements as creative fantasies accurately describing Lonnie's state of mind. But the psychic and Lonnie were accepting the drama at literal fact. And there I drew the line. How could Lonnie possibly believe it? How could she keep a straight face? I'm even willing to concede that fairies might exist, as I told her. I'm not so egotistical that I believe consciousness comes only in a human package. But I don't think that people come from fairies any more than mosquitoes are born from hawks. Why couldn't Lonnie see that the whole story was like a tale told to children, with the truth between the words, not in them? She interrupted me, saying, quote, "Look, I know that elementals exist. I threw my consciousness into a storm, and the air was full of elementals. It was wild. So if there's elementals, then why can't I be part of a species of fairies?" End quote. Again, I didn't really know what to say, though I explained what I thought as well as I could. I talk to the spirits of the trees and the hills and feel their response, but I know that this is a framework I'm using. I don't expect little tree people to come out in a merry parade at midnight, which doesn't mean that I don't feel the quite valid consciousness that formed the natural world. But so many of us think we must, quote, "see the little people," end quote, give them names and categories, mimicking the methods of objective science in an area where such methods just don't apply. When we demand such literal interpretations, we turn emotional and psychic realities into ludicrous caricatures of themselves that rob them of whatever originality they possessed. We end up with romantic pretenses, false in both worlds. In doing so, we destroy the natural flow of the intuitions, encasing them in yet another stereotyped form. Yet it's easy to see why so many people do this. We seem to think that if we can name and label exceptional events, they will be more acceptable and real. But the more, quote, real, end quote, such events become, the less potent is their internal validity. They exist in a different order of events, and that order is as real or more real than the world we recognize. That last sentence is extremely important because it implies different kinds of reality and events that can be real in one world and perhaps not exist in another. Many of my correspondents are delightful, explorative people, privately embarking on inner roads of achievement and creative exploration, for example, carrying on their normal pursuits, they still study their dreams, experiment with projection of consciousness, and search in their own ways for the nature of reality. But you can't use the criteria of usual fact to measure events that don't show in the fact world, any more than you can use a scale to measure a heavy mold. The heavy mold is real, even if the scale doesn't recognize its reality. But we search for certainties, and we're trained to consider physical facts as the only criteria of reality. For example, the day after Lonnie's call, another woman phoned to tell me about a situation that no longer surprised me, another instance of a Ouija board personality insisting that he was Seth. Quote, was he or wasn't he? Question. End quote. She wanted to know. Quote, was the entity lying? End quote. Her voice was filled with hope and doubt. She took it for granted that an entity was communicating, without questioning that term or what she meant by it. So some spirit out there had to be telling the truth or lying, or, worst of all, her own unconscious was lying, and was therefore mischievous and unreliable. Years ago, I used to share the framework of concepts in which those questions have meaning, so I understood the woman's plight and did my best to explain my viewpoint. I told her that she was working through areas of the psyche, that at some indescribable point the psyche opens up into levels usually unavailable, and that it might personify itself to get its message across. But the psyche speaks a different language, or uses our language differently. It doesn't lie, but we have to learn to decipher the language, one that is closer to the arts with their rich pageantries of images and symbols. When we dress the psyche's multidimensional creations in old, worn-out garments, we can hardly complain if they look shabby. The psyche is majestic and awesome, and our present existence springs out of its being. There's got to be a lot more there than paper gods. But maybe our original insights and visions naturally fit themselves in the contours of our beliefs so that they blend like natural psychological scenery, highlighted only now and then precisely where our beliefs don't fit together well, or in the seams of our doubts. Perhaps if we could let our structured beliefs go long enough, we could catch ourselves transforming unofficial information into conventional garb, or even glimpse what these original precepts are before their almost instant transformation. Or the contours of consciousness itself might change from level to level. If our gods and religious figures are reflections of certain areas of consciousness, we might be able to follow them to their source through further alterations of focus. It's as if we've been doing number painting translations of inner data, casting it into prearranged patterns. We're afraid not to follow the dotted lines because we might end up with a different picture of reality than the one we're used to. Our beliefs form grids, then, through which our deepest perceptions flow. Perhaps we have to suspend all beliefs momentarily so that we can experience the original perception as it is eccentrically opposed to the model we've taken for granted. Maybe we're afraid that reality is really formless, so we slap our own forms over whatever visions we receive. I'm personally convinced, though, that the models for everything, including ourselves, spring from this inner order of events, so it must have strong significance-forming properties. I don't imagine inner reality as a void or emptiness, but endowed with the propensity for individualization. Those who think of it as an ocean in which all individuality is lost might be in for a surprise, for any, quote, thing, end quote, that falls into these primordial waters may be instantly thrown up again into individualization. The physical ocean itself is composed of an infinite number of particles, even if we do think of it as one moving mass. But I think that when we project our patterns upon inner data, we break up the greater ones that do exist. By leaving my mind open as to the nature of Seth's reality, for example, by not imposing models taken from religion or psychology, I can let him define himself in his own way, through his actions in sessions, his interactions with others, and his own books. And I can be alert for his idea of definition, which may be far different than mine. Yet I believe that these models in the psyche, the gods, demons, wise old men and women, fairies, and eternal children, stand for something, and reflect truths about inner reality in the same way that the natural environment tells us about the physical world we live in. So what do they mean, and why do they appear so often in revelatory visions and automatic writings? And why do so many theories teach that bliss or nirvana sans you, sans me, lies behind everything that we know? A bliss in which all knots of individual consciousness are loosened and dissolved? Question. Again, I think that rich soup of creativity is more filled with alphabets than we suppose. a heady, thick brew, seething with activity. But for now, I'll let that pass. Still, maybe what we need is a cosmic rooster crowing on the rooftops of the world, or some animal god that would effectively disrupt our concepts enough so that we could at least peek through. And I've been involved with some divine father-mother visions of my own, so I know that they seem real enough. And of course they are. It's what's behind them that I'm after. In one such experience, mentioned earlier in this book, I felt myself rise to the heavens, where, as an infant, I was held and comforted by a man and woman seated in the clouds. I literally felt like a baby. Once I fell backward to earth, a frightening experience, even though I knew that, quote, I, end quote, was seated at my desk. My sensations were inside the plummeting infant, not in my own seated physical figure. With other beliefs, I might have seen the couple as Christ and the Virgin, or been convinced that I had been given a divine interview, or I could have interpreted the experience to mean that God returned me to earth to fulfill my, quote, mission, end quote. In other words, I could have taken it for granted that I was literally in the sky, visiting divine relatives. The emotional validity of the experience transcends such interpretations, though. The following is an example of what can happen when we interpret psychic data in literal terms and get caught up in what appears to be a power play between worlds. I first spoke to Doreen one dark, rainy June morning. I was typing up some notes and looking out the front windows at the lawn and mountains. Seth had finished dictating the, quote, unknown, end quote, reality, the book, about a month or so after we moved into the Hill house. And I was wondering if he was going to begin another book when the phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line was feminine, young, and scared. Quote, I don't know how to say this, but I'm in trouble, spiritual trouble, and I need help, end quote, she said. Continued, I wondered if you could hold a Seth session for me, or if I could attend one, end quote. I told her that we didn't hold private sessions for people anymore, and that Seth had written the Nature of Personal Reality, the book, to help people help themselves. Then I asked her what was wrong. She was a black psychologist in her 40s, doing research in racial prejudice, and she was calling from a western state. She was also married, with 2 children. She told me all of this in a rush. Then she said, quote, It was terribly hard to call you. Here I am, a black, saying that blacks can do their own thing, and I have to call a white person to ask about the nature of reality, end quote. Quote, look, we're all people, first of all, I said, but in this case, the picture did involve contrasts and states of mind in which everything was black or white, good or evil, and with a literal interpretation of psychic events. Doreen had been involved with a group practicing black magic. According to her story, when she tried to leave, members directed evil energy against her. She became ill, quote, suffered a terrible heart attack, end quote, and was sure she was going to die. Finally, Doreen went to a psychic who gave her a medal to ward off the evil energy sent from the first group. This assistance only worked temporarily, however, so she went to another psychic with, quote, still greater powers, end quote. She wanted Seth, as a still more powerful entity, to give her greater protection from the evil spirits and elementals that she believed were being sent against her. I was appalled. I spoke to her for nearly an hour, telling her to read Personal Reality, the book, reinforcing the idea that she was in control of her own life, and otherwise trying to build up her own trust and self-confidence. She hung up, and I made notes of the conversation, relating her experiences to her beliefs and levels of consciousness. I kept feeling that her call contained some important hints in that regard that I hadn't crystallized. Just then, Doreen called back, quote, there are a few things I didn't tell you, she began. Then she told me that she had visions herself, and one in particular in which she saw San Francisco being destroyed. Only the blacks were saved, and she was leading them to safety. Quote, come on, Doreen, you're supposed to be a psychologist, so you don't know what projection is? Didn't it even occur to you that anger against the whites was erupting in your visions, so that they were being punished? Question. End quote. Quote, I know what projection is, but this is different, she protested. I try to love all people, even if it is difficult. End quote. Quote, people who profess to love the world often get rid of their anger by seeing visions in which everyone in the world is destroyed except themselves and their chosen people. Their chosen group, I said. Skin color doesn't have to be involved. It can be a religious cult or a particular nation. Anyhow, the survivors are the good guys, vindicated. End quote. We hung up, but I kept thinking of Doreen's dilemma. Her state of consciousness with its corresponding belief system results in certain kinds of experiences. The psyche's pictures are thrown outward into world events, and within that framework it all makes sense, the good spirits and bad spirits, the power plays, and the sense of powerlessness beneath. You have to change your beliefs in order to focus, You have to change your beliefs or focus in order to escape the seeming evidence that keeps reinforcing itself. If you believe that you're harassed by evil spirits, that you're a victim, if you think that power is the answer and you don't possess it, then you'll always have to seek out those with greater power for protection. But after a while, that doesn't work either, because each reliance upon a succeedingly greater power diminishes the sense of self-determination. It's easy enough to see how this works in world politics, until no projected defense against possible attack by any enemy will suffice. And finally, a nation initiates aggression first in defense. Doreen's revelations also symbolically represented her vision of the world. She would be a prophet leading her people to victory. But then the dilemma, how could she perform these miracles when she was herself the victim of evil elementals? The, quote, psychic attack, end quote, was a perfect picture of the evils Doreen saw perpetuated upon the blacks by the whites in all walks of life. Powerful stuff indeed. As a woman and a black, she felt powerless. And as a psychologist, she had serious doubts that the roots of prejudice could ever be eradicated. But in her visions, she was invincible. And against that psychic vision of utter triumph, anything less seemed inconsequential. But are the devils, revengeful gods, elementals, and their kind, quote, natural features, end quote, at one level of consciousness? Question. I don't believe that they are archetypical elements in the psyche at all, but distorted versions of inner models or aspects as they are reflected through certain assumptions about reality that appear valid at certain states of consciousness. In other words, the minute we turn our focus inward, we try to interpret psychic events according to our usual assumptions, translating such data into pseudo-psychological terms. To many people, the unseen world then becomes peopled by elementals, who can be ruled by anyone with the power to control them, in a continuation of quite human power politics. The beliefs themselves act as grids, programming inner experience. The gods and demons are already numbered patterns in the mind, waiting to be filled in by any unofficial perceptions. These inner experiences are difficult to explain and interpret. Words are inadequate, so it may be handy to have such a stylized symbolic language, because the gods and demons are stylized and fairly rigid as they appear through the centuries. Perhaps that's why they seem so dependable. When we try to dispense with them, we're faced with the necessity of trying to interpret our visions and insights to ourselves without handy labels. no easy task. As I thought about Doreen, my own experiences, and those of my correspondents, I had the nagging thought that I knew more than I realized I did about visions and states of consciousness, that I already had some important information on the subject that I'd forgotten, information that would click into place, though earlier its significance hadn't been apparent. The material, I knew, belonged in this book, though I received it some time ago. My own experience had to catch up with it. But what material? I couldn't remember anything in particular. So, rather impatiently, I went looking through old notes. Psychic politics, a beautiful example, because I came upon some scribbled pages that instantly leapt up into significance. I stared at the material, its meaning so clear that I wondered how on earth I'd forgotten it or the events with which it was connected. The material had been there all along, waiting for only an event to trigger my full understanding. In Chapter 23, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha. Which is never goodbye.